Thanks, Kelly. This is Michael Staab. As Kelly said, I'm one of the co-CEOs of Innovative Arc Strategies, and let me just give you a little bit about tell you about my background a little bit. But first of all, I want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. The presentation we're doing is one that we had planned on doing at the UCS conference in Las Vegas and also again in Orlando. So it's still timely in terms of hopefully the information that you can use for 2020 as it relates to your prescription drug spend. And so we're happy to have everybody on the call today. But a little bit about my background. I am a healthcare attorney, been practicing law for many, many years. And prior to starting Innovative Arc Strategies with Greg back in 2008, I was the Vice President of Legal Services and Managing Counsel for CVS Caremark for 6 years, and was responsible for running the legal department in Northbrook as well as the contracting attorneys in Scottsdale, Arizona, and Irving, Texas. So been in the negotiating PBM contracts for a long time now, and that's a little bit about my background, and Greg will tell you about his background.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, this is Greg Madsen. I'm the other co-founder of Innovative Arc Strategies. I'm a pharmacist. I've kind of been in the PBM industry really since 1990, so a long time ago when I started with PCS back then out in Scottsdale. Prior to that, I was a Walgreens pharmacist for a number of years. So I've really kind of grown up and kind of seen how the PBM industry is morphed over time. Prior to Michael and I started being Innovative Arc Strategies, I was the Senior Vice President of Retail Services at CVS Caremark. So I held the retail pharmacy contracts. I kind of managed how the systems all had to work, how claims had to process. I also had a $26 billion P&L. I sat on the underwriting calls and kind of determined profitability for clients. I managed the MAC list, the maximum allowable cost list on the generics, and kind of controlled all that. So in 2008, as Michael mentioned, we came together to...
It's not simple for you, but it's probably simple for someone. The food is where the kids spend most of their time. And when Kelly's in the kitchen, she can't keep an eye on the kids because there's a big separate. Not to mention the fact that it's always...
Okay, we've got some significant sound coming through. Kim, can you star 5? Thanks. Sorry about that, gentlemen.
That's okay. So anyway, hopefully you'll enjoy this presentation. It's going to tell you a little bit about kind of drug cost trends for this year and the upcoming years as we go forward.
Okay, so the first slide we want to talk about is the ever-changing PBM landscape for 2020, and it seems like every year this slide changes because of all the different mergers and acquisitions that are in the PBM industry, and 2020, or what happened in 2019 for 2020 is really no different. And there's a couple of these that I want to kind of highlight. The first one here is the Optum acquisition of Diplomat Specialty Pharmacy and its PBM CashGRX, and this kind of follows up on Optum's acquisition of Avella in 2018. And so, the question is why is Optum buying specialty pharmacies like Avella and Diplomat? And a lot of it's because there's a lot of competition right now in the PBM space for limited distribution and exclusive distribution products to the specialty side. And we'll talk a little bit about that as it relates to rebates and pricing, but that's part of the main reason that Diplomat or Optum acquired Diplomat is because they are competing primarily with ESI Specialty or Credo, Express Scripts Specialty, which is a Credo, and Caremark, CVS Caremark Specialty. So there were certain products that they didn't have access to on the limited distribution side, and that probably, or it did, result in higher costs to their clients. So they felt that they needed to go out and acquire these specialty pharmacies. And I would expect that in 2020 that you're probably going to see even more specialty pharmacies get snapped up by the bigger guys, because there's still some out there that have limited distribution products. And what a limited distribution product is, or an exclusive distribution product is a specialty drug that's only available from the manufacturer through a very limited number of specialty pharmacies, because they try to control the care, or they feel that these specialty pharmacies have unique ability to dispense their medication and provide the care that the member needs. So I expect to see, a lot more, specialty pharmacies being acquired throughout 2020. We're going to spend a lot more time in this presentation, but just at the highlight here, and something that came up last year that our phone was ringing off the hook was around the gene therapy drugs, particularly around Zolgensma. And we're going to talk more about this, as I said, later on, but this is one of these areas where you really, really need to think about what you're going to do, because this is like specialty drugs. Several years ago we were talking about this train, the train coming down the track. This is one that is coming. It will be here in the next few years, and it will have a great financial impact to any employer who ends up paying the cost for these gene therapy drugs. As we said here, Zolgensma has a cost of $2.1 million. There's a drug for melanoma called Imlygic, which is going to be released probably in this country not too long for melanoma, which is another one of those medical conditions that's prevalent in this country. And there are 15 gene therapies that are in the pipeline for approval over the next 18 months, and we have a slide that actually will show you what that impact looks like from a financial perspective in terms of the overall cost. Walgreens and Microsoft have got together to kind of develop the digital health centers, or in the cloud. This is kind of in response to what Amazon is trying to do with, in their own way with PillPack, and with trying to look at getting into the PBM space on the prescription drug side. Anthem started a new PBM this year called IngenioRx. But the next one, I think, if any of you have Blue Cross Blue Shield as your health plan, or you use Prime Therapeutics as your PBM, this next point is something you really need to look at. And this was announced earlier this year, where Express Scripts and Prime Therapeutics signed a 3-year contract, which allowed Prime Therapeutics to use Express Scripts retail pharmacy network pricing and their manufacturer rebates. Why did they do that? Part of it is that Prime Therapeutics just could not compete in the market with Caremark, Express Scripts, and Optum when it came to the rebates. So what they decided to do is enter this agreement for the next 3 years with ESI to be able to use their rebate contracts. So they are using the ESI rebate contracts, which is really good if Prime is your PBM, or Blue Cross Blue Shield uses Prime Therapeutics as their PBM. So it's something you really need to think about in terms of, what am I getting in terms of my rebates? What am I getting in terms of my specialty drug discounts at retail? Because there could be significant improvements for any Blue Cross Blue Shield or Prime Therapeutic client. The next slide, and I'm sure that a lot of you have probably seen this, is already, we're 4 months into 2020, but it's the increase in prescription drugs already, this year. Earlier this year, prior to 2020, it was announced that there were, pharmaceutical manufacturers were increasing the brand prices for brand drugs for 492 different brand drugs. And how do we know that? Well, California was the first. Now there are several other states that have followed suit, that basically their Department of Health said, look, if you're a pharmaceutical manufacturer and you're increasing the cost of the brand drugs, or you've got to let us know, and you've got to file a report, and that's how we know the different brand manufacturers who have increased the cost of their brand drugs, and we're able to look at that and say, okay, there were 492 different brand drugs in the year 2020 that were increased. The average brand drug price increase on January 1st was 5.2%. That's across the board on average. The biggest increases were in drugs like Humira and Cosentyx. Humira, which is for rheumatoid arthritis and plaque psoriasis. Cosentyx, which is for plaque psoriasis. And I'm sure you've seen advertisements on television for both these drugs, because they run probably every hour on the hour. So these are pretty significant increases for drugs that are probably the most widely used specialty drugs for most payers. On top of the price increases, then you have a projected rate of 3.8% rate of inflation for prescription drugs in 2020. So if you take the 5.2 price increase and the 3.8% inflation, you're looking at about 9% this year alone for potential increase in your prescription drugs. Part of this is, and I know there's a lot of controversy here in terms of, with the increase in the drug prices, why do these drug prices keep going up? A lot of it is because it goes back in the form of rebates to PBMs. And they use that in pharma to remain competitive, particularly where if they're the exclusive drug or preferred drug on a PBM's formulary. The PBM or the pharmaceutical manufacturers are trying to compete against each other for that market share. So a lot of that drug increase, price increase, goes toward rebates, or also may go to improve the discounts a little bit. But as we said here, about 70% of the list price increase will go toward rebates and discounts. And that's important to know, particularly that kind of ties into the last bullet point about, particularly this year, if you have the opportunity of going out to bid, if you're looking at issuing an RFP for this year, or if you have the ability to do a market check this year, we are seeing some crazy rebates out there for, at retail, mail, and specialty because of, these increases from pharma. So I think it certainly is, worth your time and effort to really kind of look at, is there an opportunity to improve the pricing that you may have with your PBM. The reality is, and something we've seen, and part of this I think has been kind of the pressure that a lot of the larger PBMs were seeing on the transparent PBM, where they were quote unquote passing through 100% of the rebates. What you're seeing even with some of the bigger PBMs now is that they are also agreeing to pass through, particularly at retail and mail, 100% of the rebates that they receive. But again, I think, a lot of this is, the key point is what is in the definition of a rebate, what is included, because there are, a lot of times that P under the shelf can get shuffled, and you really have to know what it is that I'm getting in the form of a rebate if the PBM is agreeing to pass through 100%. Next slide, Greg.
So, do we want to do the poll now?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yep. So we have a poll question. Just out of curiosity, how much did your annual prescription drug cost increase in 2019 from 2018? We have 0 to 5%, 5 to 10, over 10%, or you don't know. Okay, that's for those that responded. Yeah, that seems about, well, okay. Yeah, that's pretty much in line. I mean, 5 to 10%, and some are over 10, so that's pretty standard. That's good. So, okay.
So this next slide, this is Greg Madsen talking. When you start thinking about your cost for your medications, really, in a lot of cases, it's really all about the generics, right? The generics kind of come through, and every 1% increase that you can get on your generic utilization will really lower your drug cost by about 2.5%. So there's a real advantage of kind of moving through and encouraging the use of generics through your plan design as you go forward. Now, there are a number of kind of big brand name drugs that are going to lose their patent this year, and a big one of them is Tecfidera. So Tecfidera is really an oral MS drug that's considered a limited distribution specialty drug, and it's going to lose its patent protection this year. So as that generic comes available, that will help control a lot of costs, right? Because a lot of people are moving more towards that drug, Tecfidera, because it is oral for MS as opposed to taking some of the older injectable medications. So that's really good. Typically, for most of you, hopefully, about 85–88% of your claims are currently for generics, which is really good. Now, hopefully, we're looking with these coming off patent and stuff that's getting up closer to 90% by the end of this year. Although we are starting to see some trends where some of the older generic drugs are shifting back to brand name drugs that have come on the market because the newer drugs have much less side effects, much less comorbidities. So for example, Eliquis which is really used for blood clotting, for as opposed to going with Coumadin or warfarin, right, which is kind of a blood thinner kind of thing. The Eliquis really has less side effects. You don't have to be so concerned about taking aspirin with it. It doesn't require as many blood tests as warfarin or Coumadin does. Or things like Januvia or Victoza, it's stuff you see advertised all the time, which is really for type 2 diabetes. But it's a better drug than the older kind of metformins that used to be on the generic side. So there is some shift of the generics that are going back to kind of these newer single source brands on the market. But I think from a clinical perspective, they're actually better drugs. So I think that's, in some respects, kind of positive. But I think overall, one of the things people got to remember that from a generic perspective, though, PBMs actually make more money on generics than they do on brands. So there's always that argument, well, you're chasing rebates. Well, PBMs really would rather have the generic be filled because the profit margin on them is better than what they're getting on brands. Typically, they're losing money on brands if they have kind of a traditional spread model on that. And the pharmacies are typically more motivated to fill the generics as well. They make more money on it. So it really aligns everything very nicely as the generics get promoted going through. One thing you really got to remember, though, is that once that brand goes generic, it loses its patent protection and becomes generically available, the brand manufacturers typically will stop paying rebates on those brands. So depending on how your rebate contracts are structured, if you're getting rebates on single source brands only, as soon as that goes generic, they'll stop paying rebates on it. So that's something you got to think about as well. But as these new generics come to market, though, you got to be careful of what your PBM is doing with that new to market generic. Is it considered a generic, or are they taking it and classifying it as a brand and adding it into your brand discounts, which will really distort kind of the utilization that you're getting? That's why we recommend that people really negotiate a generic effective rate, a GER, that encompasses both the MAC, the generics on that maximum allowable cost list, as well as the non-MAC generics. It lumps them all together and gets a pricing guarantee to help you control your costs. Now, from a drug price inflation perspective, as Michael mentioned, right, prices keep going up on these things, and the generics really this year, just the generic side of this thing, we could see as much as a 15% increase in the generic drug pricing this year. So as these generics keep going up, and there's a couple of issues, that kind of go along with that stuff. Some of it has to do with this whole COVID-19 piece because China manufactures a tremendous amount of the generic drugs. They're manufactured in China, they're manufactured in India, and as those plants shut down, right, there becomes less availability or more limited supply of those generics in the marketplace. So that could cause increases in prices to this whole thing. Another piece of it is that some of these generics are older generics, and as they start getting used less often because they're older drugs and there's newer drugs available, there becomes less and less manufacturers of them. So that also increases costs of those because those manufacturers, they got to make enough margin to keep the production going, and so they raise their costs. So the result of a lot of this is you got to be careful, especially when you start to monitor on the PBMs, what they're on in their maximum allowable cost list, their MAC list. For those generics, got to kind of make sure that the drug still qualifies for it and doesn't get priced, which you were getting a nice price on the generic because it was on the MAC list. Now all of a sudden it's off the MAC list because it doesn't qualify, and they start charging you the brand discount for it, right? The non-MAC or brand discount, which could cause it to go up. So what are a couple of strategies to help mitigate that? There's something to think about. Monitor, the deletion of generics from your PBM's MAC list. If you're able to get monthly MAC list updates from your PBM, that's really great. We try to do that from the PBMs that we work with. So I can see what's added, what's deleted from their MAC list and get a sense of what's going on in that. And then really understand what is in that generic bucket. What do they consider to be a generic? And that gets back to the definitions of what is a generic in your contract. But you got to be careful about where they're putting things, because if they take some of these new-to-market generics and treat them as brands, right, it's going to really kind of distort what's going on, especially if your members are paying a generic copay for them, but they're getting discounted at the brand rates, right? That's going to end up costing you some money. So again, negotiate that whole generic effective rate piece, right? Try to get all the generics lumped together into a guarantee bucket. And sometimes that we're starting to see as well is that clients are starting to implement kind of what's considered a preferred, non-preferred generic copay. So some of these higher cost generics get put into a higher copay. So there is more equitable cost share for that, right? And you get higher cost generics that are new to market and they charge a higher copay for that. That does cause, you know, some plan design issues because now instead of having just one rate for generics, you're going to have two. But it does help to start break that out and get more equitable cost shares across the board on the generic side at least. So but what are some of the copay trends that we're starting to see? And I think last year it really started, and this year it's going really strong, is that there's going to be a lot more co-insurance. I think most of you hopefully historically have had kind of a three-tier copay, right? You have a generic, you have a preferred brand, and a non-preferred brand copay structure. And usually those were flat dollar amounts, say $10 for generics, $25 for preferred brands, and $40, say, for non-preferred brands. Well, I think coinsurance is starting to come into play a lot more often to try to more equitably shift the cost to the member, right? So the cost share is more equitable and things. But we really got to make sure that, especially on the generics, that there is this minimum copay that gets put in place, if not just a simple flat dollar copay on generics of $10 or $15. And the reason for that is because on the generics, right, it really creates something called a zero balance due claim, where the cost of the drug, the ingredient cost plus the dispensing fee, is less than the member's copay. So you, the employer, pays zero for that prescription. The member's copay picks up the entire cost. So I have an example here, right? Say that the member has a $15 generic copay. Well, with that $15 generic copay, 45 or 50% of all the generic claims will be less than $15. So the cost to you, the employer, on that is zero. Right? And so that's really important. That becomes a zero balance due claim. The PBM bills you zero for that claim because the member's copay picks up everything. Now, from a specialty drug perspective, historically the specialty drugs have been in that kind of preferred brand, second tier on the copay structures. And what we're starting to see and encourage people to do is either to take those specialty drug copays and put them into the third tier, that non-preferred bucket, or create their own fourth tier, a specialty copay tier all in and of itself. And typically what we're recommending is coinsurance on that. So you put in, say, a 20% copay on specialty drugs with a minimum of, say, $75 and a maximum of, say, $250, right? So you create this window in there where the member never pays more than $250 for that specialty copay. The challenge is, because these specialty drugs are so expensive, you know, the average specialty drug now is around $5,000. Usually that 20% will cause you to hit that cap. So most people are going to have a $250 copay in my example. So that's something to consider, but it does start to more equitably shift that cost of those specialty drugs to the member, you know, because historically they were paying $25 for a $5,000 drug, and it just wasn't a very equitable cost share anymore. So when you think a little bit, though, about some of the drug coverage trends, hopefully all of you are on what's considered an exclusionary formulary, right? So, I talked about the three tiers. You have generics, preferred brands, non-preferred brands. In an exclusionary formulary, there really aren't any non-preferred brands. They get considered not covered. It's not that there's a copay differential. They're just not covered. So it really helps drive utilization to those preferred brands that have higher rebates associated with them. But the biggest challenge typically is on the insulins, right? So if, you know, the PBMs are either typically aligned with Eli Lilly, so they have Humulin or Humalog, or they're aligned with Novo Nordisk and they have Novolin and Novolog, right? That tends to be the biggest issue for the member disruptions when you start looking at going to these exclusionary formularies and restricting that access. But you know, they're not interchangeable because they're insulins and they're kind of, you know, they're biologics in a lot of cases, so they do need to go back to the physician and get a new prescription for it, but that tends to happen fairly quickly because they're pretty comparable interchanges. Another thing we're seeing is that we're excluding a lot of high-cost generics. So these generics that come to the market that have really high AWPs associated with them, they get excluded. They get excluded for a time being until there becomes more competition in the market, or that the AWPs, start to change on those and they start coming down in price. So, and then a lot of times there could be, lower cost alternatives within that same therapeutic class. For example, the cholesterol lowering drugs, right? Generic Crestor is more expensive than generic Lipitor. So you think about, having either excluding that generic Crestor, right, and covering only the generic Lipitor, or an older drug, Simvastatin, which you can get on a $4 program at Walmart, kind of thing. So those are kind of different ways to think about managing costs and the cost trends. And then it also, though, is excluding these brands that are really comprised of kind of low-cost generics. So one of the PBMs we work with kind of call this their stupid drug list, and it's just kind of funny, but because there are a number of drugs, there's some that you want to cover the individual drugs and not the combination for it. So a drug that comes up all the time is a drug called Duexis. So Duexis is about $1,000 a month for the medication, and what it's comprised of is 2 over-the-counter drugs. So Advil or Motrin, which has a generic name of ibuprofen, and Pepcid AC, famotidine. That's the combination of things that are inside of Duexis, right? So you can buy them both without a prescription, over the counter, for maybe $10 a month, versus paying $1,000 for Duexis. So that's one of the brand drugs we recommend excluding and not covering. Granted, Duexis may pay a $400 rebate, right, type thing, but why do you pay anything at all when you can just say, we don't cover over-the-counter products, and just have them purchase it without a prescription, and really get the same results.
On the member cost trend, this is always interesting, especially during hard economic times, which we're going through now. And I know employers struggle with, where do I set my copay, because I want to make sure that my members or my employees are taking their drugs and their beneficiaries as well. But typically, historically, I know most of you have probably heard of the 80-20 split, because that kind of comes from the old health insurance days, where insurance would pay 80% and the member would pick up 20%. And of course, that's somewhat changed on the pharmacy side over the last several years. The problem is on the 20%, that's kind of where you try to have the goal if you can, but the reality is on the specialty side, the member cost share is between 8 to 12. So that puts, of course, a greater burden on the employer to pay more on the specialty drug side than on the member. But the challenge is always, where do you set these specialty copays? Where do you set any copay right now in terms of, to make sure that your members can access the drugs that they need, to maintain their health care? If the copay is too high, the members they won't be compliant. They're not going to take the drug, which has the ability to impact your medical costs. So setting that specialty copay is really important, and everybody is different. I mean, it really depends upon, the payer, what kind of employees you have, what kind of money do they make. I mean, we have one client that set their specialty copay at $1,200. I mean, that's just what they just said, look, that's where it needs to be, that, because of the cost of these drugs. There are other employers that struggle with even doing 100 or 150. But it's trying to set those copays in such a way that you are making sure your member is paying the appropriate share, but you're also, as an employer, not paying more than you really want to, because you've got to provide benefits for everybody in your company. I think the other thing is, what we have found is that on the specialty side, it's also, to control that utilization is really critical to maintain a very low specialty drug trend. And I know these are, a lot of people think, well, these are big brother, type ideas, but, the quantity level limits and step therapies are really important, because really at the end of the day, you want to make sure that individual is taking the right drug for the right condition. And because of the high cost of these specialty drugs, are there other alternatives out there that may be just as good that are less expensive? Again, it's just, these are ideas I think that employers, have to consider, have to look at whether or not you implement them or not. It really depends upon, what kind of restrictions you want to put as a part of your plan. The other thing that we have certainly recommended over the last many years is really split fills for naive fills on specialty drugs. The reality is that there are specialty drugs out there, particularly on some of the cancer products that somebody may be on, where they may not tolerate it. So what we have typically recommend for clients is to look at doing a split fill for 15 days for a period of 3 months. So you have 6 15-day periods, because what we find is, why do you want to pay for a 30-day specialty drug if somebody's not going to stay on therapy after day 5? Because you just paid for 25 days of a specialty drug that nobody's using, where if you do a 15-day fill, it's a little bit more tolerable in terms of the cost because you're not paying for the full month. Then what we saw when we initially started doing the split fill program for clients is that there were people that were falling off therapies in day 40 to day 60. So, you just have to kind of look at that and implement that from a plan design and work with your PBM to say, which specialty drugs in particular or high-cost drugs should we look at in doing a split fill program to help us manage our costs? Because every year we have been able to, or the PBMs have been able to show our clients savings because of these split fill programs. The next slide, and I'm not going to, if you have time, next week, next week from tomorrow, we're going to do a webinar on specialty drugs, free specialty drugs, fact or fiction, because there's a lot going on out there right now in terms of people trying to pitch free specialty drugs and what's going on. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about today on special manufactured coupons, but if you're interested, we're going to cover everything from drug importation to copay assistance programs and other things next Wednesday in another webinar. But the reality is there are a lot of specialty drug coupons out there right now for specialty drugs, and what we try to do is encourage employers to take advantage of these manufactured coupons to help them lower their specialty drug costs, because it's free money. I mean, it is free money that you need to take advantage of, because if you're not, your member is. And what is happening is, for example, Umira, which has a $1,000 coupon, a lot of members were using that coupon to apply toward their out-of-pocket, particularly if they had a high deductible health plan, and they were just running through their out-of-pocket or reaching their out-of-pocket max that much quicker, which meant that the employer had to pick up the 100% of the cost after the person met their out-of-pocket max. So a lot of PBMs, and we have worked with a lot of them, sort of implementing what we call a variable copay program to take advantage of these specialty coupons that help reduce the cost. And so it's not that the member can't get advantage of the coupon. That's great. They can, but they only get credit for that portion of the coupon that applies to their out-of-pocket. So if they have like a $25 copay and they get a $1,000 coupon, the only credit they're getting toward their out-of-pocket is the $25. So, which is a good thing. And the remaining value of the coupon that is really being used to help lower the plan costs for those particular specialty drugs. So I think that, and I think it's important that you ask your PBM what specialty drugs do they have access to specialty manufactured coupons for, because every PBM, as we have found out, they're all different. I mean, when we do an RFP, one of the things we ask is what specialty drugs do you have special manufactured coupons available, or can you access? And it's important to know, which of these coupons you can access through your PBM to help you lower your costs. So I think that, again, it's free money. Take advantage of it. Don't let your members, run through their out-of-pocket accumulators, or sooner than they should by taking advantage of this. So, and I think we have another poll question here that we wanted to ask everybody is. So the poll question is, are you taking advantage of specially manufactured coupons to lower your prescription drug costs, yes or no? Wow. That's
About
surprising.
50/50, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's yeah. You really need to think about that, because that's money you're leaving on the table that you could actually benefit from. So, it's something to think about. And if you want, tune in next week, and we'll give you more information about what you can do on that.
So one of the other trends that we're starting to see more and more, and I guess it's starting to get into restricted pharmacy networks, right? So that when you think about, they've been around for a lot of years, 15 years at least, right? So kind of this whole thing, and typically what they'll say is that we're going to either take out Walgreens or CVS, right? Those tend to be the big chains that they take out. And that way the market share moves to these other pharmacies, and these other pharmacies then give better discounts because they're going to get more prescription volumes coming through their stores, right? And it really only works for kind of limited to ERISA plans, plans that are preempted by ERISA, because there's a lot of states that have passed any willing provider laws, which means that, if you're a health insurance or some sort of funded benefit, you have to offer that to any willing provider. You can't restrict the network down, right? So, but employers are ERISA plans, right? And so they're able to do the restricted network coming through. But the challenge is the PBMs historically only give about a 1% better retail discount when you do these kind of restricted networks. So to take out a Walgreens or take out a CVS, they may improve your retail discount by maybe 1%. And usually there's no improvement on the generics, and there's really no improvement on the mail discounts or rebates. So you got to start to think about, gosh, is it really worth it? Is the savings worth it for all the disruption, right? Because you think about, nowadays Walgreens, CVS, and Walmart, those three chains, and maybe throw in Rite Aid in some areas, they're filling 65, 70% of all the prescriptions are being filled by those three guys, right? It's just incredible. And if you start taking one of them out, right, it creates a lot of disruption. So the challenge is it really worth it to think about doing it to just get a 1% better discount? What's happening instead is that there's going to be kind of these 90-day supplies. So you're able to get your maintenance medications to get a 90-day supply at a pharmacy. And there's a couple of different models of that, because a lot of PBMs will offer what's considered an open 90-day retail program, where any pharmacy that wants to participate can. They got to accept a slightly more aggressive brand discount going through, right? So, but it's not the same pricing as you would get if it went to mail, right? So it's better than retail, but it's not as good as mail. So in those cases, you got to be really careful about what you do with your copays, right? Because if you allow somebody to get a 90-day supply, but they pay their mail order copay, it's going to cost you a lot of money. So what we recommend for people that really do these open 90 networks is that they tell the member, you can get a 90-day supply at these pharmacies, but you're going to pay 3 times your retail copay. You can get 90 days and you pay 3 times your copay. So if you got a $25 brand copay, you're going to pay $75 to get a 90-day at your local pharmacy, right? That's kind of thing. That becomes at least cost neutral from an employer perspective and adding that value. What's really changed more and more, though, is that Caremark pioneered something called maintenance choice. So when Caremark and CVS merged together, I was one of the guys that helped coordinate this whole thing. What they decided to do is that you can get your mail order discounts, and the member pays their mail order copay if they go to either a CVS store to get their prescriptions filled or into mail order. But that's it. So it was really restricted to just CVS's, right? Kind of thing. From an overall perspective, the CVS guys hated it because they're taking mail order discounts at retail, right? And they didn't have all the automation that can manage all that kind of stuff. And the Caremark mail order guys didn't like it either because they were losing a lot of volume out of their mail service into the CVS stores. But from an overall perspective of the enterprise, it made a lot of sense, because if you're getting a maintenance medication at a CVS, most likely you're going to get all of your medication at the CVS, right? You're not going to get some of it one place and some of it at another. It tends to, everybody migrates into the thing. So it was really proved to be very, very successful. And the members liked it, the employers liked it. It ended up being pretty successful. So Walgreens really countered that, right? Walgreens needed to do something because they were losing market share coming out of their stores. And so they introduced their own kind of maintenance choice network, the Walgreens 90 piece. And they went out and contracted with Express Scripts and Optum and Envision, Prime Therapeutics, right, to offer this whole Walgreens 90 program. So now you really have kind of a couple of options out there, right? So because CVS has done it as well now. CVS has offered their network through various PBMs as well. So now you have a choice of kind of going to Walgreens or to CVS through a number of PBMs and really getting more mail order discounts at those pharmacies, and their members would pay their mail order copay just as if they were sending it in the mail service kind of thing. So the whole trick, though, and to think about, though, is it a mandatory or is it a voluntary program? That's something you got to think about. If you know, remember historically, a lot of the PBMs that had mail order would do a mandatory mail benefit, which meant that the member could get 2 fills of their prescription at a retail pharmacy, but that third fill had to go into mail. It had to go to mail order, otherwise it wasn't covered. It was a mandatory mail benefit. So you got to think about these 90-day maintenance choice, Walgreens 90 programs. They have that same kind of flexibility. They could be a mandatory program, but in most cases what we're recommending is that they become voluntary. That it's a voluntary program. If the member wants to get a 90-day supply, they can. They just have to go to a CVS or they have to go to a Walgreens to do it. They can't go to their local pharmacy, right? So it's still voluntary, but it still has that restriction to it, and that really helps kind of from a member satisfaction perspective as well as a cost control perspective for you, the employer.
We could probably do a whole webinar just on specialty drugs, so one slide is nothing to really give specialty drugs justice, but I think that the reality is that specialty drugs are now closing in on 50% of an employer's costs. We had one annual review last week with a client of ours that their specialty drug costs were at 55%. So, and they will continue to go up because that's where the costs are. There a lot of these are, of course, for rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, and cancer drugs, and they're and other specialty products as well. But that's where pharma is putting their research and development dollars. I mean, it is in specialty drugs, and we'll talk about it a little bit. It's also in the gene therapies. But the discounts. While we're seeing a little bit more competitive discounts on the specialty drug side, and like Greg mentioned, like Tecfidera is a limited distribution product that's going generic. I think that clients really need to start thinking about looking at an overall specialty drug rate, but that includes both brands and generics. But I think that the next battle with PBMs is really to try to break that specialty drug cost into both brand and generic discounts, because I think that that's going to do a lot in terms for employers in terms of the strategy that they employ about whether or not you have to take a generic specialty drug before you can do a brand specialty drug. So there's a lot of things from a pricing standpoint that I think that employers need to be thinking about for not only this year but for 2021 in terms of how they're going to cover specialty drugs. I think that the reality is if you look at your specialty drug list, you're going to have a bunch of discounts on for each of those drugs, and then it's going to be an overall specialty drug discount guarantee. That because you have the discounts are not the same because they have different rates with manufacturers, but you want to try to get as high as aggressive as a special discount as you can. The other things we recommend, and I know that there's a lot of back and forth as to how much should you limit the day's supply for specialty drugs. Our recommendation is that you limit it to 30-day supply. Yes, I know there are people that are on MS drugs, and there's some people that will say, well, you should allow them to get a 90-day fill. The problem is you still want that specialty pharmacy to reach out to that member to make sure that there are not any other conditions that they're having. And it's just nice to have that touch point, I think, every 30 days as opposed to every 90 days. And the reality is the other thing we keep trying to get PBMs to do is to try to negotiate sort of a 90-day rate for specialty drugs. I mean, there's a lot of reluctance to do that. So quite frankly, I don't think it makes sense for you to pay for, a 90-day fill, which is the same discount as a 30-day fill, but you don't have the same touch point that the specialty pharmacy has with the member. So I think that, it's just something to think about. Step therapies, should there be a step therapy before somebody takes a high-cost specialty drug? There's some that certainly lend themselves to step therapy protocols. And I think that for every employer, and probably most of you probably have some kind of stop-loss coverage for high-cost specialty drugs, but if you don't, it's something you should really look at, consider having to help you manage your specialty drug spend. The rebates, as Greg talked about earlier in the presentation, about 90% of all claims are going to be generic, and hopefully that will be higher than that going forward in 2020 and 2021. So that still leaves about 8% for traditional brand claims at retail and mail, and 2% for specialty drugs, for brand drugs and biosimilars. And I think that the one thing to really, particularly on the specialty drug piece, on that 2%, is really making sure, not only when it comes to rebates, but also your discounts as it relates to limited distribution products that particular PBM specialty pharmacy has access to. And am I getting a better discount, or am I getting a better discount for limited distribution products as I am for regular specialty products that are being dispensed by that PBM specialty pharmacy? If you're not, you should be asking for that. And the same thing with rebates, because I think sometimes what happens is some of the larger PBMs, they want to exclude, because they understand that most clients don't understand what it means to exclude limited and exclusive specialty drugs from either a rebate or the discount. And so it just goes through the contract. I can't tell you how many contracts I've seen in the last 6 months to a year where limited distribution, exclusive distribution products are excluded from the guarantee at specialty as well as the rebates. And that's hurting you, because if you look at the number of limited distribution products at a big PBM like CVS, ESI, or Optum, and now Prime, they have a lot. And so you need to if you don't ask for it, they're not going to give it to you. And because of the specialty drugs that we're seeing they are really, really going up in the value of those rebates. It used to be $1,000 rebate for specialty drug was a good deal. Now they're way above that amount. So again, it's important that you take advantage of that. And as Greg pointed out on these, formulary exclusion lists, I mean, quite frankly, if you look the difference between a formulary and an open formulary, or formulary exclusion and an open formulary, there are so few differences. But where you get hurt as an employer, if you don't do that analysis and also look at the formulary disruption, is the amount of rebates that you're getting. There's very little disruption anymore, and I think that's why we recommend our clients consider, a formulary exclusion list. If for whatever reason you feel it needs to be open, that's fine, but understand it's going to impact you financially. The price protection inflation guarantees, I know that was, PBMs are making a big deal about that a few years ago as a way to try to help clients share, if there's a rebate because of the price inflation. That still exists, but there's a lot less emphasis on that now than there probably has been in the past. But it's something that you should ask for. But again, this 10% of those claims for retail mail and specialty drugs, there's a lot of value in that in terms of the rebates. And I go back to what I said earlier. Given the rebate contracts that large PBMs have used, it's important. So next thing, we'll just talk briefly. This is something that we wanted to add to this presentation because we just wanted to kind of give you a heads up. And 340B is complicated, but this is something that has the potential to impact every employer who has a PBM contract and is getting rebates. Long story short, you may have members that are going to what's called a 340B covered entity, which is typically a disproportionate share hospital in your community that may service Medicaid patients, or it may be if you're in a rural area and you have members that go to a critical access hospital or a CAH, or they go to some other clinic that is considered a 340B clinic. there's language. It used to be that pharma, and there's been a lot of controversy over the whole 340B program because pharma kept thinking, why do my costs keep going up? And a lot of it was because of the 340B program. What we have seen, we do annual pricing audits and rebate audits for our clients, and this year Greg was doing our annual pricing audits on behalf of our clients, and what we were seeing is that there were some PBMs that were starting to claw back rebates, and we said why? Because it's not in the contract. What we found out is that their pharma apparently is now doing audits of rebates of the larger PBMs and their rebate contracts, and saying, well, so-and-so, the member went to a 340B hospital, and the hospital was able to take advantage of the 340B pricing, and they, even though the employer doesn't, but we're not paying a rebate to the employer for that particular claim. So what that means is you may have a member that you didn't even know that was having your claim reprocessed as a 340B claim after you paid for it, and they're basically using your money to give it to the hospital as a, because they have a deal with the specialty pharmacy as a contracted pharmacy to have a better rate. And so this is it's something we're dealing with, and we saw this. We wanted to let you know that this is something that's on the horizon. So, and Greg is going to kind of walk through what the impact is because of this reprocessing of 340B claims after the point of sale.
I know we only got 8 minutes left, so I want to be kind of quick on this, but this slide really, it just gives you an example of what's going on. So say the specialty drug costs $1,000. The specialty pharmacy can buy it for AWP minus 22%, right, or $7,800, and it sells it to you, the employer, at AWP minus 18%, or $8,200, right, and then the specialty pharmacy makes a $400 profit. Right, the PBM, right, that for the specialty pharmacy receives a rebate on that drug of $2,500, roughly 25% of AWP, but they pay you, the employer, $2,000 of it. So they keep $5,000 of that rebate as their retention and profit on this thing, right? So, but from you, the employer's perspective, your costs were going to be $8,200 minus your rebate, right? So your net cost of that was $6,200, right? And so you've gotten your rebate, the PBM, it gets paid out 3-5 months in advance, but you've received your rebate on this piece, right? And so you're good with thing. And now all of a sudden, the specialty pharmacy, though, this claim that one of your members went to, because it went to a physician that was in the clinic associated with this hospital, so there was a patient encounter at a covered entity. That's kind of the legal phrases that happens. And so now this claim becomes eligible to be processed as 340B. So what happens then? Well, what happens is, and the hospital gets 340B pricing, and say their pricing is AWP minus 60%, right? It's really great government pricing, so it's only $4,000 for the hospital for this drug. So what the specialty pharmacy does is essentially forwards its $8,200 that you've paid it for the drug to the hospital, right? And then the hospital pays the wholesaler $4,000 for the 340B drug to replenish that drug back at the specialty pharmacy. So the specialty pharmacy just gets the drug put back on its shelf, right? And the hospital then gets to keep that difference. But the specialty pharmacy gets an administrative fee for doing this. And say that administrative fee is 20% in this example, or $840. So the hospital makes a profit on this, right? They got the $8,200 from you that went to the specialty pharmacy. They paid the wholesaler $4,000, and then they had to pay the specialty pharmacy their admin fee of $840, but they net $3,360. That's the hospital's upside, right? And you remember hearing about Duke Medical Center and stuff making $60 million a year in profit. This is how that happens. But now the problem is the claim is no longer rebate eligible because it's now considered a 340B claim. So pharma gets their rebate back. They paid $2,500 in rebate. They get a credit back for that. The PBM theoretically loses its $500 in retention profit because they've credited back the PBM. The specialty pharmacy, though, makes $12,400 on this. They get their $400 from initial profit they got, plus the $840 admin fee for reprocessing this whole piece. But the kicker to this whole thing is that you, the employer, lose your $2,000 rebate. that gets taken back from you. So your cost is now $8,200. That's what we're identifying coming through doing these audits, and we're exploring it pretty significantly with the employers or with the PBMs to make sure we understand how that's impacting our customers.
Yep. Okay, well, I have a little bit. I'm going to kind of run through these gene therapies. I know, like I said earlier in the presentation, this is a really big area, and it will continue to be an area you need to be focusing on for the next several years. But gene therapies are basically a cure. I mean, they basically identify a genetic material in a person's DNA, and they have developed these therapies to basically act as a cure. The first one that kind of came out was Luxturna, which was for an ocular disease or retinal dystrophy that resulted in blindness. But the one that came out last year, which caused the most consternation for a lot of employers, was Zolgensma, which is the $2.1 million drug for spinal muscular atrophy, which is a cure. Otherwise, most of these kids either die within a very short period of time of birth, or their life expectancy is no more than 2 years. But the next slide is one. When I saw this slide, is one that just was stark, and this is one that when you look at it, you're going like, oh my gosh, this is the train that's coming down the track, and how do I deal with this? Think about this. This is the estimated last year in 2019. The estimated gene therapy sales were $282 million for those two gene therapies, Luxturna and Zolgensma. Fast forward 5 years to 2024. That now goes from $282 million last year to $8.6 billion. That is a tremendous amount of money that they're forecasting for these gene therapies and the cost. And the question is who's going to pay for this? If you go to the next slide real quickly, you'll see these are the gene therapies in the pipeline for the next 2 years. And the reason you're going to have to make some hard decisions about what you do from a benefits coverage standpoint is a lot of these are pretty common diseases where you may have already incurred medical costs prior. For example, if you've got a hemophiliac, if you've had somebody that has thyroid cancer, glioblastoma, which is what John McCain died from, melanoma, which is skin cancer, multiple myeloma. These are all gene therapies that are in the pipeline, which are probably going to get approved, that once they're available will be a cure. And what you need to do, and if you look at 2021, then you have other diseases, for angina and myocardial ischemia. These are things where you're going to have to really look at making a decision about where do I cover this? How do I pay for this? Because these are cures. So, for example, if you have a hemophiliac, do you go ahead and cover that? Because what we're hearing is that the pharma manufacturers of these drugs are not going to discount it, because they're saying, hey, look, if you want to pay a hemophiliac $1 million for blah, blah, blah for factor over a period of time, that's up to you. But if you want to use my drug, you can use it as a cure, and you won't have any of the medical expenses that may be associated with it. So you're going to have to do that cost-benefit analysis involved. Greg will kind of go through here about some of the management cost therapies.
So that's the whole thing, right? Where are you going to cover these things, these gene therapies? A lot of times that Zolgensma, right, it happens, the baby gets it within days of them being diagnosed, right, after being born, whether or not they have it. And so it gets administered in the hospital. In a lot of cases, right, it's $2.1 million. Your planned stop-loss carrier doesn't know it's coming, right? They can't laser it kind of thing. So it's just kind of, where do I cover this? So do I cover it on my pharmacy benefit? Do I cover it on my medical benefit? Do I cover it at all, right? That becomes one of the issues coming through in this thing. But hemophilia is going to come down the pipe, right? So then you got, like Michael said, cost benefit out of that. Do I cover the gene therapy for hemophilia, or do I just keep covering the factor and hope the kid ages out or whatever out of the coverage, right? Those are all kind of things that have to be considered and thought through on this. But there's going to be a lot of pharma kind of do custom programs to help pay for some of this stuff, but then you got stop-loss carriers that can take into consideration as well. So those are all kind of some challenges that I think we got to think about. Do we have time for this poll, or are we out of time?
Yeah, so the follow-up question is, are you considering covering the gene therapies? And the question is, under the medical benefit, under the pharmacy benefit, excluding coverage, or I really don't want to think about it right now, and I'll deal with it later. So we thought we'd ask this question to kind of see where people are on the spectrum.
Yeah, that's not unusual, right? I think a lot of people are saying, I don't know. I don't know what's going on in this. Do I cover it or not? That becomes, I think, one of the biggest challenges. So kind of the key takeaways, though, I think from this thing is that if you haven't gone out to bid in a while for your PBM pricing, do it, right? There is better pricing out there. It's more aggressive. If you've had stale generic pricing, stale rebates, there's significant upside to have someone, help you negotiate and get better pricing to help kind of control your costs. Generics are key on this whole thing, but you got to kind of monitor what's going on. Due to that increase in specialty claims, the cost share between the member is really important, right? Recommending putting in kind of percentages in there with min-maxes to help kind of shift a little bit of that over. Take advantage of those manufacturer coupons on specialty drugs. Do that variable copay program so that you get the advantage of that full coupon and that your member doesn't kind of blow through their out-of-pocket or their deductible too quickly. Retail 90 networks are an option, especially the ones that restrict access down to Walgreens or CVS, on these 90-day programs. There are a way to give some convenience, and specialty rebates are significant, right? You got to go in and be able to negotiate significant rebates on those things. With the average cost of these specialty drugs being $5,000 plus, you really got to negotiate aggressive specialty discount rebates to help kind of offset some of that cost.
So thank you. I don't know if anybody has any questions. If you do, you can certainly give them, send them to Kelly, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you guys have offline. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to listen to us. And
thank you, gentlemen, both so much. This was fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, check your email tomorrow. We'll send you a link to register for next week's webinar with Innovative on specialty drugs, and look forward to seeing you all again online soon. Gentlemen, thank you again. This was a great presentation. Hope everyone has a great afternoon.
thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.